Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Astral Radiance, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be going over our top 10 decks from Astral Radiance. We have Milwaukee and the NAIC coming up in a really short period, and it's really going to give a good test to Astral Radiance. We've had one regional so far, where the new Palkia V-Star was utterly dominant, but we have had some other in-person tournaments and online events that show that it's not entirely one deck dominating the rest. So we're going to go over our top 10 choices today, talking about the lists, where we think the meta is right now, and yeah, basically the best techs you can be playing at the same time.
Yeah, so just before we start, we have on the very left the most recent late night series tournament, the popularity of sort of the most popular decks, so you can see how popular different archetypes were. In the middle, we've got some tournament data, thanks to Trainer Hill, based on the Play Limitless tournaments that have gone on in the format with Astral Radiance, basically just showing how many top 8s each of these different archetypes have received. And then finally, the last IRL tournament, which was the Melbourne Regional Championships, which, as Joe mentioned, Palkia was absolutely dominant at. So you can see how some of the other decks in the top 16 played out, so you can sort of translate those across the page. But yeah, that's all the data we need. We're going to kick off with number 10.
Starting with Turbo Dialga then, a very spicy deck that sort of came out of the woodwork in some of these online events, and it spiked some big tournaments. You know, these are like 300-player events. Even though they're online, there's plenty of people vying for contention, and it certainly has been able to come out on top in a couple of these, based around this Star Chronos V-Star power here, allowing you to take an additional turn. Extremely powerful effects. This is actually one of the most disruptive decks in the game, simply because you can take something off the board, the opponent can't react, then you can take something else off the board if you've stacked up enough metal energies onto your Dialga so that you can metal blast through something else, which I think is very dangerous, especially with Avery. Right now, matchup-wise, it's actually pretty reasonable around the board. Palkia Inteleon being a slightly awkward matchup is going to be something to be aware of and be afraid of. I think a lot of the reason around that is because they can insta-respond with a Storm EV, and then you're pretty much just done, because you can't help but put a ton of metal energies onto your Dialga, so they have an easy instant response, even if they do get their full combo off of Chronos and Blast. So just bear that in mind, that Palkia can be awkward if teched against. And then Blissey Miltank is your other most awkward matchup. Going on to the list, I mean, this is pretty cookie cutter at this point. We've got a heavy Mew engine. That's going to be a card that we try and get as many uses out of possible, with Air Balloon, with cross switchers, with scoop up nets. Nets can be used with Mew and also Radiant Greninja to reuse their abilities, basically to try and access as many metal sources as possible, because that's how we're going to power up this very expensive Dialga to get rolling. Typically, this doesn't play like a typical deck. You're literally powering up one Dialga in the entire game. If that doesn't go the distance, you've normally lost the game. Every now and then, you can maybe weave in this Zacian as well as a final chance attacker, especially because it's a great card to end your turn on if you happen to Intrepid Sword and hit an energy here and there. Sometimes it's worth holding them in the hand to help with Radiant Greninja for the following turn, but it can be a good thing to have that backup, especially because this is playing 4 Saucer and 1 Raihan. It means that you don't instantly scoop the game as long as Dialga's dealt with. The Zacian could be that follow-up attack in the game as well. You're playing cross switches, which is naturally good against other people playing Diancie. We're not playing it ourselves in here because there's simply not the space, really, in this sort of deck. You basically just try and put both Dialgas out there. Don't play your sources, or don't commit your sources until you're ready to rumble, is really the main takeaway here. And Avery is the key supporter card. If you can use this on the turn you're popping off with your Star Chronos, you can really disrupt the opponent's board and leave them with nothing left at all. And for potential includes, you've got the Aegislash, which can be a wall-breaking Pokemon. You saw that Blissey Miltank was one of your hardest matchups. That's because we're currently not playing an answer. Add in one Aegislash, you're going to have a great time. You have your own Miltank that can be good in mirror situations, as we just saw. Miltank is something you can't deal with in the list right now, and it could be also good against other turbo engines. And Birdkeeper is another great pivoting card, which continues to draw cards deeper into your deck, rather than having shuffle effects like Marnie or dump and draw like Research. They don't really go very well in a deck like this, because you're trying to grow your hand size so significantly that a Birdkeeper could be that final include if needed.
Next up, we have Ice Rider Inteleon. Ice Rider has, again, kind of always been floating around this sort of top 10 deck. Never had huge success, but again, its numbers are always very, very appealing. Max Lance pushing to 280 way more consistently now just because of things like Hawlucha, but now you have multiple different angles of being able to reach this damage and multiple ways you can then reach the 310, which is always that good mark for Mew, which is still obviously around. I feel like this is a deck that's not had like huge amounts of play compared to some of the other water decks in the meta, so that's why the stats look a little bit skew. There's a lot of exactly 50-50s and stuff, but honestly a lot of these V-Star matchups do seem pretty strong. The numbers are great. You have to deal with some sort of inherent consistency issues compared to some of the other Inteleon decks, and you're not playing something like an Arceus to grab 2 cards when you want, or you don't have this acceleration or anything like that. You're just really relying on the Inteleon, which we've seen can sometimes be a bit of an issue. There's still people taking for Inteleon and stuff like that. But in general, you're really trying to build off the back of Ice Rider Calyrex's numbers just being so strong into these V-Stars. And trying, there's lots of, it's not just Arceus now that you're really trying to target. There's lots of different V-Stars with great numbers for you to deal with, and there's again less and less VMAXs, which means you don't have to find this big combo of reaching over the top of 300 anywhere near as much, and it's even easier now as well. So lots of appealing things. It's a little bit, still feel like there's some inconsistencies here and there overall. You can see there's a few sort of 30% and 20% here and there just against some of the less popular decks, but mainly like Mew Genesect is one that scares me a little bit. Palkia, it looks like in general the Inteleon list again a little bit unfavored, but I think in general this is probably more than anything due to not many people trying out the list too much. I do think it has a fairly decent matchup into some of these V-Stars, but not the most consistent, so that's kind of what holds it down, I think. Taking a look at the list, like we mentioned, you can play the Radiant Greninja or the Radiant Hawlucha. I really like the Hawlucha just for pushing into those numbers. Palkia is a perfect partner, to be honest. Really takes the pressure off of Melanie, lets you actually be aggressive with bosses, which is basically what Ice Rider has always wanted to do, right? You've got great numbers, but you were capped by the fact that you just had to Melanie every turn and deal with whatever they threw in the active. Now, at least once during the game, you can hopefully Star Portal and be able to take a big KO, or just using Palkia as obviously an incredibly strong attacker anyway. Is really, really strong. I think Irida really helps the engine as well. Irida helps massively with Inteleon engines just in general because it's such such a brilliant card for trying to initiate the sort of Drizzile dance and the different combos you can do, this, that, and the other. But when you're playing it in a water deck itself, you actually open up the door to being able to grab attackers and stuff like that, which is just incredible. So yeah, really, really strong stuff. We've got a couple of potential includes as well. Kind of the obvious one that we're not playing is Starmie. We've mentioned Starmie already. And it really is a good tech attacker, especially against some of these decks that like to flood the board with energy, whether it's things like Dialga that do it all in one turn, or something like an Arceus that just does it throughout the game. Starmie is always going to be a brilliant tech include. Leon, again, just the trying to deal that key number of 280 or even 310 is going to be really important. So having lots of ways to do that is going to be important. And then finally, just research. Again, the consistency of the deck can sometimes be a little bit worrying, and you're not too worried about discarding that much in the deck. You have ways of getting the energy back. You can play plenty of things that you're playing high enough counts to be able to not be too worried about research in the early turns. Again, I still think you want to be trying to boss a lot of the time just because you're actually able to do that now. But just research for the early turns still feels pretty strong.
On to number 8 then, we have Arceus Duraludon, still hanging on in there, and actually has a decent enough matchup spread. It's really around that sort of 45-55% in most situations. I think its Palkia matchup is suspiciously low, because it's an archetype that can keep a pretty low bench the entire time, and can shove a ton of healing cards into the deck. Basically, when I was doing this as Blissey, it was very effective against Palkia, and I think Duraludon can do the exact same thing here, where it has that high Hyper Potion count, it has Crystal Caves at its disposal, high natural hit points, and just can slam those Aviaries and play no bench Pokemon itself. So I feel like it can do a very similar thing, and I found that pretty effective against Palkia so far. So its numbers are a little bit shy, but then again, it has its own consistency issues, so you do have to accept that your opening turns can be a little bit ropey, but we know the strengths around this deck. It has a very good time into the new Regi deck as well, which is very popular. It was the 3rd most played deck in some of these recent tournaments, and it seems to be a deck that a lot of people are flocking to as a budget option, a fun option, and is reasonably competitive. Obviously, it's not on the slides just yet, but it is going to be on our top 10. So, yeah, Duraludon has a lot going for it. As we jump into the list, it's not too dissimilar to older ones that we've seen in the past. We are upping the Avery count because it gets even more value, as we say, into Palkia to help your tanking strategy. We're also playing a high count of Hyper Potion, 3 copies as well as 4 Crystal Cave, really just trying to sit there in the face of a Palkia player, make them, go wide on their board. You're going to sit there with 1 or none, and on the bench, you're just going to sit there Hyper Potioning away. It has great synergy with the DTE, of course, and you just want to see this combination in your hand the entire time. Gmax Pulverization also helps you get through Blissey and Miltank, which is another frustrating deck that you don't even have to sweat the matchup at all. So yeah, pretty straightforward list there. For potential includes, I know some people do go for the Cheren's Conviction. It can be a great late game card that can help you get through that final V-Star in particular in those later stages of the game in a one-hit KO style fashion. Raihan can be used especially as a bounce back if you do have your Arceus able to sort of burst a Trinity Nova out of nowhere. It is a potential option. And then Ordinary Rod is a card that I know some people like to play in Arctura to play around Echoing Horn. I'm someone that likes to thin as much as possible because I don't trust this deck's draw engine because it's just supporter based. So normally I'm constantly thinning my basics out rather than shuffling them back in. But based on where Echoing Horn is right now, it's obviously a good include still in Mew. It's potentially decent in some Palkia builds as well, so it's a card that you can put into your deck for some peace of mind into those matchups.
Next up, we have Inteleon Toolbox. Obviously, this kind of deck always exists. It was doing really well towards the later stages of this the Brilliant Stars format, and again, it just kind of always is one of these decks that adapts to whatever the meta looks like. You've sort of taken out some of the older options and added in some new options for things like Palkia and stuff. You can see, don't be alarmed by the Palkia zero there. I think basically a lot of the tournament data happened before the Melbourne regionals, so there's actually not huge amounts of data on Turbo Palkia. But you can see the Palkia Inteleon is a little bit more reasonable, a little bit closer, which I think is definitely appealing. I think this is the kind of deck that you're always going to try and just target things you expect to see. That's why you can see a pretty high Mew win rate still, just because the Dark package is definitely a staple in the deck. You have ways of dealing with Arceus, and things like all of the different techs you can play, along with a couple of other nice includes from Astral Radiance, mean that you don't have to play some of these more awkward cards anymore. I think Regi's is actually an interesting one. It feels like these one prize decks can sometimes be it's really interesting sort of how they interact with one another. I think you inherently are a bit slower than them. You don't have any great immediate option. Admittedly, they don't have great early options for you, they need a bit more of a board than you do to be able to start attacking, because you can just attack with a Hooper or whatever. But your game plan really sets up. It's very reactive, and it's really set up based on how your opponent's doing, and because you can't really uptrade into that deck, you really do struggle there. So I think that's a bit of an awkward one. But yeah, this kind of deck always exists, trying to find ways to answer the meta. And as you see with the list, you've got a couple of interesting cards here. Metachamp V has kind of been in and out of some lists anyway, but now it gets to be this Yoga Looper, which is great, obviously, but also with the super effective glasses, gets to be our option for dealing with Arceus, which is great because it means that we don't have to play Zapdos and rely on them not having a path out or anything like that, or them having enough Vs to attack, or all of this kind of stuff. Now that we play just one card and we're not too worried about that, that can be quite flexible. Super effective Blast is obviously really, really good with the Moltres and the Zeraora as well, just for, kind of working similarly to Choice Band, but with Moltres, for example, it lets you attack a turn earlier against Mew, which is great. Zeraora is the option for Palkia. We're actually up to 2 in the list just because it's also a free retreater, which is absolutely busted. The lists before were playing plenty of ways to switch out, even sometimes Air Balloon and stuff. So now just having a Zeraora on your board means that after you've sustained a KO, you don't have to worry about finding a way to move or anything like that. You always have a pivot, but also it works as a fantastic attacker into Palkia, as I'm sure most people are aware now. Choice Belt Zeraora does 200. Does 300. So I know a lot of Palkias are sort of starting to play things like Tool Jammer and stuff, but you can still get there through the use of things like Inteleon anyway. Oranguru helps with the Marnie protection as well. It's still one of the deck's worst nightmares is just getting Marnied sort of once or twice, especially in the early turns, because again, you're a very reactive deck, and if you're sustaining a prize loss whilst also getting Marnied, it can sometimes be difficult to react. So that's still kind of an awkward one. But yeah, Irida really feels like it opened up this deck again. I think we're always going to see this kind of list around. There's always these kinds of decks around to try and counter the meta. In terms of other potential includes, we've seen some lists playing the Cottonlift Eldegoss. We're moving very much into what feels like Avery being quite a staple in a few different decks, and a lot of the time Eldegoss has to be the first thing that goes, just because you need your Inteleons online to be able to consistently pull off these combos. So we've actually moved away from playing Eldegoss and just going for more of the item-based energy search, that kind of stuff. Raikou is another great option into Palkia, but it is a two-prizer, so again, the list wants to be as reactive as possible and wants to make them take as many prizes as possible. There'll be certain situations where obviously we're using Medicham, we have to use Medicham, and there'll be situations where a Raikou would be better than a Zeraora, but we feel like Zeraora does enough, and you don't want to fall too far behind by having to play or even start with a Raikou. And finally, Rowlet. Rowlet was, I feel like, the star of the show for a while, but unfortunately there's so much Manaphy about just because of Radiant Greninja and Palkia these days. I feel like Rowlet really has lost a lot of value, as well as Inteleon. Whilst again, there's lots of different Inteleon decks around, and like even you can even hit Muse and things like that with Rowlet. There's still just so much Manaphy sort of protecting them inadvertently just because they don't want to be double Greninja'd anyway. That Rowlet definitely loses a lot of value, which is a shame because it definitely was a selling point of the deck. But for now, I think he's back in the binder.
On to our number 6 then, which is going to be Arceus Bibarel. It's really hard to chop up Arceus, so bear with us here. But these are going to be builds that are trying to use Industrious Incisors as a backup engine. I think Arceus Crobat Bibarel was popular for a long time. We even saw it with Hammers, as well as a variety of other attackers alongside Crobat, be it Corviknight or other type coverage mons like Lucario V-Star at different points. So we know the engine is there, where you just sort of play a variety package of stage 1s and try and hit for some key weaknesses. It's really hard to look into the data too much with Arceus because there's such a variety on Trainer Hill of decks that get lumped into this Arceus pot, so it's really down to your own testing to see what tech attackers do well for you. I think it's pretty clear that Crobat is still going to be helpful because Mew is still going to be one of the more popular decks, and Crobat is naturally a good consistency card, and I think Flying Pikachu is one that a lot of people are flocking towards. Not only does it help you against Regis, a little bit of help against Blissey Miltank, you still maybe in a deck out war against them actually, but it's also hitting a key type coverage into Palkia. And you can see that right now, Arceus is okay into Palkia and Palkia Inteleon. It's still reasonable for you, so I don't think it's a lost cause by any means. And then Arceus Malamar is trying to be the sort of more disruptive option that you have available to you. Possibly one of the best abusers of Jolteon Memory Capsule with that Thunderous Awakening to turn off water Pokemon. It's a bit of a headache against these turbo lists, but it's far less effective now that that has been discovered. But Jolteon is still very strong against the Inteleon engine, of course. So that's going to be one of the core ways we try and shut down our opponents, as well as trying to hit them with Paths, Marnies, and yoinking a card out of their hand with that Malamar VMAX. So let's have a look first at the type coverage sort of box here, just with a 2-1 line of Crobat and a 2-1 line of Flying Pika. Bear in mind, Flying Pika is great for that free retreat, really helpful. Lets you only need to play one Rope 1 switch pretty comfortably and not have to sweat it too much. I'm playing the full 4 copies of DTE to try and get the early Trinity charges as well as Novas. And we are playing Belt Zig, and that high boss's orders count as well. The Rope, of course, can be a way around Diancie, or at least force players to put double Diancie down if they are turbo lists. So you can try and weave in that turn 2 boss's orders, which I think is great. The one thing that really stands out here is that I've gone to 4 Marnie and 3 Path, which is like a lot higher than previous builds of Arc. Bibarel, I've actually foregone Cheren altogether because I think it's just far less of a useful card right now as the game has become more turbo orientated, and usually you're happy enough if your Arceus tanks, like you're already like pretty far ahead in a lot of these instances. So I'm just going for the disruptive route here, trying to really slow down those Mews, make sure that Path is established, combine it with the Marnie when you can. especially because players are playing less Roads and Phone to protect themselves now. And at the same time, it's still very strong into the turbo lists. If you can drop those paths early and the Marnies against them, even though they have Pumpkaboo and a ton of outs, they may have to spend their only Ball Search in hand for a Pumpkaboo, so then they're not using it on like Crobat and popping off. So I think that's a really nice combination you can have, and it's also a sentiment I've shared in the Mali list, which is of course more geared towards that sort of controlling element. Where we are playing the 2-2 Jolt and 2 Memory Capsule in here. That's sometimes your Starbirth option. Sometimes you're doing the tried and true, just get your Malamar down and something to attach onto. But yeah, the natural high Marnie count and the high path count, I think, is the way to go with Arc right now. Definitely these Bibarel engines. For potential includes, at the moment I'm so high on Marnie because I think it's way better against the turbo builds that I'm not playing Roxanne. Specifically as well in the Arc Mali list, I found it very difficult to weave in that Roxanne at the right time because naturally you're playing Bibarel, you can't cherry pick it quite as easily unless you choose to play Luminion, which is another sort of question, I guess you could say, whether or not it's worth it just to have the option to Roxanne. But I think trying to capitalize on these turbo engines early and just go, boom, here's a path, here's a Marnie straight away, puts them more on the back foot than some of these other options, and the game could have already slipped away from you before Roxanne's got good. Cheren's Care, less valuable, I think, in a format where there's probably a little bit more hit KO. Palkia just hits such high damage output, and you can't help but go wide in a lot of these instances. You need the help of Crobat. Sometimes you can go forego Bibarel, but you always want something else to attach onto at times, so it's a little bit difficult for you to stay completely out of range. Maybe you can try and do it for your first Arceus, but from there, you pretty much give them free license, and you're hoping the Pikachu can be the tank at that stage. And Avery, you know, we've seen how good it's been annoying Regis. Yes, you have Flying Pikachu for one of them, but it could help out in the Mali list for certain. If you're trying to Avery them whilst also cherry-picking cards out of their hand, it can be very strong with that Mali VMAX combo, so it could give you some defense in that matchup, and in general be annoying for Inteleon builds and hurt their overall outs to improve when you're yoinking cards away from them.
On to top 5, we have Blissey and Miltank at the 5th place spot. I think the first thing to look at is the matchup spread. This has a really, really respectable matchup spread. Lots of above 50s, a couple of very favourables, which obviously, again, can be teched. You can tech for this deck, and that I think in general is one of the inherent issues with a deck like this, is people are aware of it. People will be looking for different techs, trying to find ways around it, especially given that there's also Regis in the format, which can kind of also get caught up in that tech spot if you're looking for ways to deal with basic Pokemon, for example, rather than Wall Break or whatever. So I think that's one scary thing for the deck. But looking at the matchup spread, it's really, really appealing, to be honest. There's lots of very positive matchups, a couple of awkward ones, but you know, I wouldn't be expecting a high amount of Duraludon, to be honest. I wouldn't be expecting a huge amount of things like Rapid Mally and Urshifu. So the matchup spread looks very, very appealing, to be honest. I think the deck can run into some issues, especially given that there's lots of ways to, like, you know, disrupt the opponent and stuff, but at the end of the day, it still feels like some games are definitely like teetering on a knife edge. But just look at how it's doing into some of these more popular matchups. I think there is huge appeal to a deck like this. Like I say, it's a bit scary that people are aware of it and it gets caught in the crossfire of these two decks that people are really hyped on it right now. I think Regis and Bliss Tank are two very much fan favourites of the format, to be honest, just because they are so new. They're not Mew, they're not Arceus, and they're not Palkia, and you know, they're a bit different, they're a bit quirky. So I think they are very popular right now, which scares me a little bit for the amount of people that will be teching for them. But you know, even with text, having to deal with multiple Blissies that have 250, 300 HP and that are healing and stuff like that can just be too much to deal with, even if you do have some kind of out in some instances. So yeah, I think the deck is very appealing. I don't think there's much like trickery or anything with the deck. There's nothing like crazy about it. It's just, you know, trying to really be kind of boring and make your opponent go through a lot of HP and disrupt them as much as you can along the way, which is, you know, a fair enough strategy. Looking at the list again, lots of 4-ofs, just trying to really be as consistent as possible, because I think that's another kind of scary thing sometimes with the list is, you know, you can sometimes look at your opening hands and be able to like, I need something good over the next couple of turns. You really have to lean into drawing cards as Greninja and stuff like that sometimes. But, you know, look at the amount of healing options. Look at the, you know, Avery's, Crushing Hammers, Full Path to Peak. All of these really difficult cards to deal with. You know, you're going to put a lot of pressure, not necessarily like super quickly with the deck, but just resource-wise. And then, in the late game, Blissey actually can be doing a really respectable amount of damage, to be honest. So, yeah, definitely an interesting one. We're not playing Manaphy or Dunsparce if we head over to the text. Basically, because you have to play both for them to be effective. You can't really play Dunsparce without Manaphy because it just gets picked off. And if you're playing Dunsparce and Manaphy, they just pick them off one by one. These are the easy prizes that they want to take, right? So you don't really want to put easy prizes for them down. You want to have to force them through Miltanks or force them through 300 HP just to get a couple of prizes. So whilst they do definitely help, it kind of actually doesn't help with the strategy in general. Quick balls, again, you can have some pretty sketchy hands here and there. So just having more outs to not getting benched is pretty important, as well as additional ways of being able to discard some energy to start powering up that Blissful Blast. And also, yeah, just more outs to find Greninja, because it does feel like the deck really wants to find Greninja pretty early. And then just more healing, Team Yeltao. There's plenty of different healing options you can run. We think this is the best, just to be honest, because it's guaranteed healing, and that's almost all you want to do. You're not even that fussed about them getting a 50 heal back, because as the game progresses, you're doing more and more damage. So it's actually in your favor to just to be healing yourself a lot of the time. So yeah, really interesting deck. I must admit, I'm not the biggest fan. It's pretty unenjoyable to play against, but you can't disrespect it. You really do have to think about it going into these next couple of tournaments, I think.
Similarly, we have the Regi Gang. Regigigas has proven to be a real deck in the format. Its matchup spread is a little bit wonky with some 30 and 40%ers here and there, but I think if you hone in on Palkia and Mew, those are positive. The Palkia Inteleon, interestingly enough, isn't super positive, but we can get onto that into a moment. I think that's mostly because of tech includes like Ice Cube, but I think Regi has started to deal with the tech cards and adapt its own deck list accordingly from the list we saw initially doing quite well. So I do think at its core, having a strong Mew and a strong Palkia keeps this deck within that top 5 pretty much throughout the Astral format, I'm pretty sure. That Ancient Wisdom ability is just so powerful, very difficult to sort of slow down once you have started and got the full gang out and you've got enough energy in the bin. You're pretty much always getting that reload on your next guy. It's really a case of, can you get your next Stormy Mountain? Can you get your next Capture Energy or Ball Search card alongside your rods? That's the only thing you need to keep track of for the remainder of the game once you've started to get the Ancient Wisdom up and rolling. You've got some key weaknesses that you're hitting. Obviously, Regieleki is strong into Palkia. Regigigas is great into Mew VMAX. And those extra snipes from Regieleki is also just very powerful. The Regirock is good into Arceus once you've dealt with their Dunsparce, and the new Aleki is a card that can help do that as well, even force Manaphy out into most matchups. I actually think most people do proactively look for Manaphy against Regis these days, because you love coming out swinging with the Aleki, not just because you have that spread potential, but because you're naturally also finding and playing Speed Lightning Energy in those opening turns to help consistency. I think that's one of the only things holding this back from higher percentages. The consistency is rough. Sometimes you twiddle your thumbs for a couple of turns, and it's really awkward because obviously you're giving up prizes as you go, but also you're losing a piece every time they're taking a knockout, and it forces you to have an even better turn the following. So if you do have those stumbling blocks at the start, the deck can feel very weak. But if you get that turn 1, turn 2 Ancient Wisdom off, you're really racing quite nicely because you have high enough hit points on most of your guys that you're not going to get ruined by random Medicham tactics or anything like that. It's not very easy for other 1 prizes to get into the mix. They're usually having to use their own 2 and 3 prize Pokemon, which lets you have these uptrades, which I think is very strong for you. It's only really Arc Duraludon, which is like the L that we're taking in our list right now, because we're not playing we're playing Stormy Mountains rather than Path, but we have seen successful lists playing that Path of the Peak. Notably, the Japanese national winning list was playing a high Path count. Path gives you a way to beat Arcdura. It gives you a way to get around Empoleon V if that's going to be a tech card, and it helps obviously slow down some turbo engines. You at least turn off the Greninja, you turn off the Palkia itself, you force those outs, and it can sometimes randomly help against the likes of Mew and Arceus as well, of course, that are ability reliant. So if you want to have that slightly cheesy factor, you can try and play Path. If I was naturally playing Path, I'd also work in Marnie, because they're just a natural synergy that you can play between the two. But right now, pretty simplistic list. I'm pretty high on the speed lightning count as well, compared to most, just playing that 1 Lotto. I do think it's a valuable card, but I do still like Tracking Shoes. It was something not played in the Japanese 60, but gives you extra cycle, extra discard, potentially of lightning energy, any energy, which is great. I'm only at 3 rod, which is potentially greedy. I know some people are at 4. But we are playing those ropes as well as nets now. Ropes help you get around Wheezing, they help you get around Empoleon, and they also help you push an Ice Cube to the bench so you can use the new Alecki to do the 120 snipe as well. So definitely a decent card, as well as giving you some extra potential to deal with bench Pokemon just naturally, because you have to pick your moments to boss's orders when you only play 2 copies, and typically you're wanting to draw cards throughout the first 2 turns just to get your board state in the first place, so boss is essentially off limits, so having that rope available is very nice. On to some potential includes. Silene is actually a really interesting one that has only really come to me as sort of inspiration. I'm thinking about Roseanne's backup as well as Silene. At the moment, I think Silene would probably be the better include, especially if I was thinking of playing like a 2-2 split of stadiums, Path and Stormy. Silene sounds like a really good card where it's like slightly better than that third Path of the Peak, because at times it can get you like a Choice Belt to the top of your deck or a Regi to the top of your deck, and then you can just Trekking Shoes into the card, or you can Speed Lightning into the card. So you actually play, you know, at the moment 6 outs, but if you tweak your deck to have Silene in it, you can go to that 4th copy of Speed or that 4th copy of Shoes and get instant access to that card that you're just putting to the top of your deck, which I think is really cool. It gives you some Avery protection, gives you some Stadium reuse to help against Collapsed and help you path out against Arcdura as well. So I do want to try out Silene and Roseanne's backup as potential includes, because right now I'm on 3 belts. I think it's so strong against Palkia and Mew that I want that 3rd copy. But Silene is in that sort of flexy spot that I do want to try it out. So that's one that I've only just really discovered and feel like it's a good card that can come into the list, because it lets you cheat some space, similar to Mew, where like you want that 4th copy of a switching card, you want that extra this, that, and the other, but having Silene in there lets you sort of stitch it all together and make you think that in situations where it may not be fine, it could be fine. So I feel like Silene is probably stronger than just a 4th rod in general, especially if you lean into it.
Next up, we have Arceus Inteleon at number 3. Again, we've kind of had to lump some of these Arceus builds together just because of the way Arceus is. You could have a top 10 Arceus decks, to be honest. So we had to find a way of lumping this stuff together. Everyone knows what Arceus Intel is about. It's about being as consistent of an Arceus deck as possible. It's about trying to, you know, be have some energy acceleration, but also just, you know, be a bit of a monster at 280 and, you know, trying to Trinity Nova turn after turn and trying to do it as consistently as possible with Starbirth. I think Palkia is a bit of a worry for the deck, naturally, just because Palkia's numbers are so insane, and as we mentioned earlier on, a lot of these Arceus decks do need to go wide. Rather than going for bats and stuff in this build, you just need your Sobbles out, but it means that you're kind of giving Palkia free damage, and there's nothing you can really do about it, because you know, you need to have your game plan, you need to find something else to attach to, that kind of thing. In general, I feel like Palkia hasn't changed too much, though. Arceus hasn't changed too much. It's still super consistent. It's still really, you know, it really keeps things honest. I think that's something that Arceus does really well. Is you know you're going to be allowed to announce Trinity Nova 3 turns in a row. Well, as many turns as you need to, and just, you know, force the opponent to try and deal with you as quickly as possible. Looking at the list in general, you know, we've tried to keep it kind of similar to some of the successful lists just before Astral came out. This is kind of similar to Henry Brand's list and Matthew Burris's list, the one that was really strong in the latest Australian tournaments just before Astral Radiance was released. Playing those double cross switches, so you can combine that with something like a Marnie or a Melanie or even a Cheren's Care or something like that, just to, you know, really try and have a very powerful tempo return. Still got things like the Zigzagoon and Belt in here just to, you know, deal 220. It's still a big tempo push. Going first is always going to be important as Arceus, so being able to really punish one of these 2 prize Pokemon and start the game rolling can be one way you can kind of get into the game against Palkia, just because you struggle to reach over the top, but sometimes you're just trying to deal with their 2 prizes, especially things like the turbo build. You know, you have ways of being able to, once you've dealt with the Diancies, you have ways of being able to punish all of these 2 prizes that they play. You also have cross switches as well that you can weave in the early turns to try and really disrupt them. But yeah, as similarly with the other Arceus lists, we're playing a high Path of the Peak count. Not quite as high of a Marnie count, but obviously with Intel, you're able to like pick it out of the deck exactly when you need it. And Path of the Peak still feels incredibly strong in this format, as we've mentioned, as well as the Collapsed in here. Obviously, we've mentioned how important it is against things like Regis, but just again, it actually helps as trying to give your Arceus is a bit more HP, collapsed plus Big Charm actually can mean that they're kind of out of range and it's difficult for them to get back into range with Palkia. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. Again, nothing too crazy with the list, to be honest. Just trying to be as consistent as possible, and just try and keep other decks honest is, I think, the best way to play Arceus at the moment in terms of the Inteleon build. A couple of techs we have, again, Roxanne, obviously, with this kind of engine, you can pluck it out of the deck exactly when you need it. Roxanne Path is still huge. Roxanne plus Collapsed is still annoying for things like Regi and stuff. Just Roxanne in general is obviously a very strong card. It feels like the meta is kind of, or the way that Arceus has to play it is it really has to pick and choose its prizes quite carefully, and because of that it can sometimes be difficult to weave in a Roxanne turn, whereas Marnie is kind of good in the early turns where you're naturally just fine hitting into whatever's active and just starting the prize race anyway. So it can sometimes be a little bit awkward to weave in the Roxanne, but if there's a deck that can do it, this deck has the best tutor in the game, right? So it's going to be able to do it at the right time. Starmie V, again, as we mentioned, basically in every other slide with Starmie on it. It's great for the mirror. It's great for all of these decks that try and flood the board with energy, which is brilliant. And finally, the Echoing Horn. Again, Echoing Horn, I think, was in the original list that was played in Australia, and is still definitely a respectable card. Again, you really do need to pick and choose these two prizes that you take prizes on, to be honest, just because you're not a V-Star deck that can reach V-Star numbers, really. You're kind of capped at your damage. You kind of have a pretty low damage cap compared to some of these V-Star decks. So trying to bully the two prizes with the Echoing Horn is definitely one line that you can take.
In at number 2, possibly for the first time in a while, we have Mew VMAX, potentially dethroned. Still, obviously, an incredible deck. Has some of the scariest turn 1 going seconds known to the game right now, thanks to Meloetta, and that ain't gonna change. Still can draw an absurd amount of cards. Yes, the new Mew Greninja net engine is giving Genesect a run for its money, but I think pound for pound, normally you're getting more out of Fusion Strike system. So yeah, it's still a very powerful option. There's probably less spotlight on Mew as well, which I think is a really interesting dynamic that we haven't really seen. Mew Genesect, towards the later stages of Brilliant Stars, was sort of competing 50-50 for Arceus, but for a good amount of time, everyone was like, if I can't beat Mew, why am I even turning up to this tournament? Whereas now, people are doing those same things, but talking about Palkia instead of Mew, which is actually an interesting dynamic to see, that there's probably going to be a lot less dark around, just sort of tech Pokemon, really, for the most part. There's a lot of paths still, naturally, but so many like turbo engines and stuff right now gives Mew different challenges to what it's used to. It's really just having to fight the fight against chunky 2 prizes, mostly these V-Stars, where you have power spike turns with power tablets and choice belt and such, but you can only really do that once, maybe twice if you get lucky with Silene, so you need to try and get your prizes elsewhere. That's where things get a little bit trickier for Mew. But in general, you're still the most consistent deck in the room, you're still keeping everyone honest, and you have Catcher High Roll as well, which can really throw a spanner in the works. I think Catcher build was one that we've tried to pander away from as much as possible in Brilliant Stars, but Diancie gives us enough reason right now that you just say, yeah, I guess I probably should be playing these catchers. If I can use these to get around tech mons anyway, it just sort of makes sense right now. I'd still love to be just playing that high boss count and increase my trekking shoes, increase that Rotom Phone count that little bit more for consistency. But if you are expecting these turbo engines to be popular, you pretty much just have to go for those catchers and try and have the Wombo combo where you get to Sparkle, attach Echo with power tablets. If you can do that with the catcher involved, it's going to be absolutely crazy. Silene and Shoes are still at the 1 counts for us right now, only because catchers take up so much room, but Shoes are naturally obviously very good cards, help you cycle that little bit further. Every now and then you get the high roll of being able to discard a VIP pass here and there as well, or random other cards that you don't need at the right time. So yeah, I think it's naturally very solid. I think the best selling point for Mew as well is that you know you're going into the tournament with like 58 cards perfect, because we've ironed it out for so long in the Brilliant Stars and Fusion Strike meta that you know that your deck is going to be running smooth like butter, and everyone else is adding these random tech cards here and there and are still figuring out the best 60s, whereas Mew, like, it's done for you. You're literally stealing someone else's homework and putting your name to it, and that's a pretty good thing to go for. For potential includes, if you want to go down a route where you play Pumpkaboo, you can just play it on its own, but you could lean into Pumpkaboo even more if you wanted to play Fog Crystal and maybe even some Psychic Energy and Training Court and whatnot. Could be a sort of mini package that we have seen in Mew in the past. I still like the high DTE count right now that Whimsicott has pretty much gone away, and there's not much reason to play Whimsicott in the format right now. And same can be said for Beedrill, really. I think it's less useful overall, so you can get away with DTE. So the Fog Crystal itself is a little bit less valuable, but Pumpkaboo and having a huge amount of outs to path is always a nice peace of mind. Rope could be another thing. Right now, we just have the catchers and 3 switches, but if you want to go 2 switch, 1 rope, 3 catcher, you can do that as well. It's a way to, again, force double Diancie out in turbo builds, or it could be a way, sometimes you get the cram heads and you just need to rope something because they only have 2 basics out, so it means that you're not going cram heads into catcher heads. That's sometimes a pretty high roll of play. And then finally, there's the option to have some additional 1 prize attacking Pokemon. I think Ice-Cube gets way worse in general than it was because there's so much mana fee. So Deoxys would probably be the go towards, especially if you want to change up your stadium count altogether towards Tower of Darkness. Deoxys becomes a great 1/2 count even if you're expecting lots of 1 prizes like the Regi deck and stuff. If you just come out swinging with the Deoxys before they get rolling, you can get too far ahead that it doesn't even matter that a Gigas could do huge damage later on. So yeah, I think Deoxys is a decent card to help fight some Miltank, fight some Regis and whatnot, and still be good into these like dark toolbox 1 prizey decks as well.
And to no one's surprise, Palkia V-Star is obviously number 1. We've lumped the Turbo build and the Inteleon build together, basically because the community sort of put them pretty much as even. We think they're pretty much even. I think we've both played a bit of both and both like both, so it makes sense to just lump them all together. Obviously, we all know how strong this card is. If it's strong enough to take Mew off the top spot, it's serious, and it has some crazy potential. Regardless of everything else and the results it's had in Melbourne and all of this other stuff, just the stats on the card, again, crazy. The damage output is insane, and Star Portal opens up so many options for tech attackers and just sort of attacks out of nowhere and different lines of play that you can make. You can see that there's plenty of great matchups for you, especially for the Intel build. I think the top line of stats, the Turbo build, is slightly skewed lower than some of the matchups than you lower for some of the matchups than you expect, just because we've only had a few tournaments where the Turbo build was kind of known, so I would expect those numbers to be going up. A couple of maybe the high 75s to be coming down just as variance happens, but I expect a lot of these 40s to be moving into the 50 bracket. So yeah, you can see the matchups are insane, the card is insane, the options within the deck are insane, both builds are very, very strong. So yeah, there's huge upside to playing this card, right? It's just a brilliant, brilliant card. Looking at the lists, we're going to kick things off with the Turbo list. Very close to the winning list. We have managed to find space for a Cologne. We feel it's pretty important. There's lots of different mana fees around. There's lots of different other annoying things like the Miltank and stuff around. There's lots of different things that the Cologne can hit, which is pretty important. Other than that, the list is pretty much identical, just trying to, build off of that Mew engine, trying to Mysterious Tail for lots of cards, and then trying to basically lean into the Palkia, Star Portaling, being able to just attack with the Palkia, or have these options like the Starmie, the Suicune, and the Radiant Greninja, all built around basically drawing lots of cards with Greninja. Yeah, we really haven't changed the list much because I think the list is very, very solid. It does exactly what it wants to do. You don't need to change too much about the winning list to immediately be winning games, to be honest. So yeah, very, very strong stuff. And the Inteleon build, again, this is playing a couple of interesting cards. Things like the Path of Peak and the Temple of Sinnoh instead of the training courts that we've seen some lists play. That's essentially because these stadiums alongside Marnie and Roxanne are very good in certain matchups. Path is obviously as disruptive ever in conjunction with Marnie, but also things like Temple of Sinnoh plus Roxanne against Regis can basically stall them by 1, maybe even 2 turns, which is obviously incredibly strong. Got the Tool Jammer in here again, just respecting people playing random tech Zero Auras. It's not just the Intel box that can play it. Basically, any deck that plays or has the ability to play Raihan and sort of doesn't care too much about the energy can easily pop in a Zero Aura here and there, or even a Raikou. So, just keeping that in mind, taking the Tool Jammer for the Zero Aura to keep it yourself out of range is pretty important. And yeah, just in general, obviously, again, really trying to lean into the Inteleon engine, which it feels like people have moved away from Inteleon in general, which means people have moved away from Jolteon a bit more. So Inteleon does feel like it's still pretty safe. It feels I'd much rather be playing an Inteleon engine now than sort of 2 or 3 weeks ago in the Brilliant Stars meta, because it felt like Inteleon was really hated. And even though there's more water Pokemon to hate with Jolteon, I felt there's less of these Jolteon decks around. So again, a bit less turbo, a bit more combo centric in terms of sort of building up combos throughout the throughout the game with the Drizzles and stuff. But still an incredibly strong deck, and one that you have to respect, really. Potential includes Leon. Again, just pushing that damage is pretty important. Can be pretty strong in terms of trying to reach over the top of where your opponent maybe thinks they can actually get. Obviously, your damage output is somewhat limited by their bench, so you've really got to kind of keep that in mind. Training Court, again, we've seen that these Training Court lists are doing well. So definitely worth including, obviously being able to double dip with Greninja, as well as just having access to more energy throughout the game is going to be important, as well as Ice Cube with that block face attack. Hits 2 great matchups right now, Regi's and Blissey Miltank. Obviously both of these decks are kind of aware of this now, so they're starting to be able to tech around it, but still it's going to get you some value more than likely, because you're going to be seeing probably maybe even 3 of those between those 2 decks around your day 1 sort of meta. So yeah, definitely a worthy include if you think you are going to be hitting some of these all basic decks.
So that wraps up our top 10. There are some definitely vying for contention, though. There's certainly some question marks around Urshifu. It was Tord and a few other of the top American players who really brought Urshi to the limelight and had some insane results with the deck. So it's one of those ones where it's hard to write it off, but I don't necessarily know how it needs to change in order to compete. So I'm not going to lay my hat on Urshi right now, and it doesn't have many online results. Also does naturally get caught in the crossfire of Manaphy being everywhere thanks to Moonlight Shuriken from Radiant Greninja and everyone wanting protection against that. Although Urshi can play Cologne now, so there's ups and downs to Urshi. There's probably less Mew in the format as well, which is a good thing for it, but I guess on the other side of things, there's less Arceus at the same time, so I don't think Urshi is necessarily terrible into Palkia. It should be a pretty interesting back and forth between the two of you, where you can have Cheryl plays and whatnot and try and get around them, but obviously Palkia can represent a lot of threats with different attacking mons as well, so going to be one to try out for those Urshi fanboys, but I don't think it's necessarily a popular deck and one people need to prepare against too much. My spicy leak deck for these next 2 weeks is going to be Arceus Greedent. Turning a profit has never been so easy when there's Mews everywhere as well as Sobbles. So play 2 different sets of gloves, the Sponge and the Cleansing, and you can seriously turn a profit on a lot of Pokemon right now. If you were down to Clown, I think this is a potentially really strong pickup. So I'd love to see some Greedent on stream at least once. Make it happen, guys. I'm sure you're up for it. So yeah, definitely a cool one. And then just to round out the top 3 here, there's also Gengar, which did do well in Australia as a turbo engine. I personally really dislike VMAXs being chucked into this sort of engine where you have Mew, Greninja, and Crobat, because it's so easy for your opponent to take that one prize and actually be meaningful to their prize map. Even if people are two-shotting a VMAX, it is far less strong than when it's a one prizer going down and then you still force the opponent to deal with 3 V Pokemon. It's very, very different. So I think Gengar's probably the best among them if you are going for a VMAX approach, just due to its typing, really. It needs so little to be pressurizing Mew. It has Dark Patch now, and that Gmax Swallow Up is very similar to Ice Rider, really, where it just hits the good number. So just try and let your VMAX take out 2 V-Stars. That's tremendous value for you. You just need to find your last prizes here and there in those sorts of matchups. So I think Gengar has some potential, and we know this engine has a ton of potential. So that's one that you can maybe keep your eye on and could get some results this weekend.
Yeah, and onto the other 3. Turbo Darkrai actually has a really impressive damage output, and I think it's a pretty cool tempo deck. I think in general it just sort of falls short a lot of the time, which is a shame, but we've kind of mentioned how there's a lot of different decks out there that you can just try and out-tempo. There's a lot of ways of being able to do that, and Darkrai actually can do that with a fairly decent couple of turns. Even just sort of leaning into the Galarian Moltres, it's still a pretty impressive attacker. Obviously, it doesn't really have the results behind it, and I think there is kind of a reason for that, but it's definitely a really fun one, and I think one that can actually surprise people with the amount of damage output you can get, even from like sort of the second turn of the game, to be honest. Rapid Melee is a really interesting one. It felt like it was pretty much done for. There was so much Jolteon going around, and then Roxanne looked to be a real issue for the deck. But honestly, Roxanne hasn't been splashed in as many decks as possible, or as we initially thought. And whilst it could definitely be a tech in a lot of different decks, you know, it's not anywhere near as prevalent, which is good. And also, again, we were still in a pretty V-Star heavy format, but there was still a few VMAX decks around. But now we're even more so in a a V-Star heavy format. Hitting 280 is still pretty reasonable for the deck. It's just one less card, but that one less card is huge because you know, that means that you do have flexibility with your Cynthia. You're not trying to go for that Dream Cynthia every turn, which is pretty important. So yeah, Malamar feels like it could be good against some of these one prize decks as well if you're able to start sort of out of the gate pretty quickly. That's kind of the most important thing, is just trying to take the early prize against some of these turbo engines and stuff. But yeah, could be an interesting one. And then finally, Frostmoth Inteleon is one that I've played around with a little bit. It's a really, really interesting deck. It's a lot of fun. It has a lot of options. And again, any deck that has something like a Frostmoth can easily, naturally just kind of have an array of different attackers that you can use at any point. Inteleon as an attacker feels very good. Aqua Bullet 120 for 2 from turn 2 because you're playing the candy is actually pretty threatening against especially some of these one prize decks. It does feel like it struggles with Palkia a little bit. It feels like you have to have some pretty insane turns. You have to sort of be able to hit through the first one, sort of two-shot through the first one while setting up the second for something like a Crabominable, and then try and play around or play in such a way that you can take an early snipe KO with Greninja or something. Because Manaphy again is pretty annoying for the deck. Maybe you do have to play something like the cancelling Cologne and stuff in the deck to try and get around that. But it's such a combo centric deck already. You're trying to do so much stuff, trying to get, even with Inteleon, trying to get stage 1s and more attackers and plenty of energy out can sometimes be quite convoluted. So yeah, it's a really fun one. I really like it, and there's lots of really great water Pokemon out there that kind of have just been waiting for Frostmoth to be good, and now it's just about to rotate out. Maybe it is finally to just give it one last hurrah and give it a go. So yeah, definitely try it out if you're looking for something a little bit different.
So that wraps up everything of our top 10, guys. Let us know your thoughts. What decks are you thinking about bringing to the tournament? What do you think are going to be most popular? What's going to be rounding out that top 8? Is it going to be another Palkia Fiesta, or are people going to come with the counters? Last time we had this big knee-jerk from an Australian regional, there was none of... Well, it was Mew at the time, right? So it was all Mew and then no Mew, and now we have the same thing going on with Palkia. So I wonder how the North American metagame is going to adjust for the biggest tournament of the year. I'm so jealous that neither of us are going because, man, it is so much fun to be at the NAIC. It's just different to any other tournament. The atmosphere is just great, and there's just so many great competitors traveling out there. So we're going to tune into those streams and enjoy them. They are going to be over on the official channels, so you're going to get great coverage of both of these events, which is fantastic. If you were going to be going, Jack, what would you be putting your time into?
I still think I'd be playing Mew. I still think Mew is very, very strong. We've put it as our second place, and I'm pretty sure it's kind of going a little bit under the radar with all of this crazy Palkia hype. So I'd be on Mew, but I could definitely see myself picking up Palkias and playing Palkias as well. I'd just be playing one of the top 2 decks, to be honest, because I think they're so head and shoulders above the rest for me.
Makes sense.
I'd be going for one of those.
Yeah, for me, I really like the sort of one prize toolbox. It fits my playstyle so well right now. I really enjoy coming up with those combos and watching the sort of plan unfold. I think it's also has that nice gambler thing. Those opening turns can be so shaky, but Irida gives you so many better starts that it makes me very hopeful for a deck like that. And also I would try out Greedent. So I really hope people get involved and get lured into that deck, because that could be just hilarious to see it turning profit for so many prize cards. Anyways, we've been rambling for so long. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Let us hear your thoughts down below, and we'll be back for another video tomorrow. Cheers.